Hello, everybody. This is Rick Manning, President of Americans for Limited Government. And I just wanted to get in here and talk to you a little bit. We're in the regular, getting used to it, shut down the government week. And with all the pearl clutching and everything else that goes with it, one of the challenges is very simple. Um, the only thing that there's 218 votes for is just kicking the can forward and not doing anything about spending. And that's not an acceptable approach. The challenge is that you can get 100 Republicans to say, let's just go ahead and do the same thing we've always been doing. And and you can get all the Democrats to say that. And so Speaker Johnson has has the same problem Kevin McCarthy had, quite frankly. Speaker Johnson knows the problem. He knows we have to cut spending in this city. We have to get that done. And yet, the challenge is, how do you functionally get that done in a world where in the House you have the votes to do nothing, but you really have to work hard to get the votes to do something, to actually do something about it. And in that world, you have some saying, I won't vote for it unless you have some significant cuts, and others saying, I don't want to vote for the significant cuts. You have appropriations bills that have been put on the floor, which have gone down because Northeastern Republicans want to fully fund Amtrak. And you have others that have gone down because some Republicans don't want to pay for some of the farm subsidies. So you have these varying balancing acts that have to occur. And we know that Speaker McCarthy ended up getting a vote of no confidence, losing his job because he went across the aisle, made a deal with Democrats to effectively just expand, continue going along the same path we've been on. And so Speaker Johnson's sitting there trying to deal with that aspect of it. And by the end of this week, they're going to have to come up with an answer, or the government will, or part of the government will be shut down. A small percentage of the government will be shut down, but a part of the government will be shut down. Adding into this mix, and I'm going to talk about the solution Johnson's offering here in a second, but I just want to add one thing into this mix, and that is that Moody's came out and said that, or declared that they were going to downgrade the U.S. credit, potentially causing interest rates for Treasury bills and for repayment or for debt instruments from the U.S. to go up. Ironically, Moody's, this is one of the frustrating things about this, and they're very clear in citing that we don't have, we're spending a whole lot more than we're taking in, and that's Moody's was one of those ones that, when we're fighting over the debt ceiling just a few short months ago, Moody's was kind enough to warn that if we didn't continue to spend as much as we were, and undercutting the entire attempt to actually cut the budget during that fight, Moody's was very kind to say, well, gee, if you continue on this path and you don't raise the debt ceiling, then we're going to end up downgrading. And so if you actually try to fight to do something to cut the budget, then we're going to downgrade. But because it just tells you the kind of trouble we're in. And one of the interesting things, and I'm just going to give you a graphic here to show you kind of what we're talking about. This graphic here is the U.S. federal spending. This is U.S. federal government spending in billions of dollars from 2019 to 2023. Okay, so no, this is 29 pre-pandemic. Okay, this is pre-pandemic. You'll note all other spending. All of the spending is what the Congress is arguing over now. Okay, that's what Congress is arguing over is how is that spending pot. You'll note that's a smaller spending pot than the rest of the budget. Spent in 2019. Mandatory spending, that's Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, was about 2.1 trillion. Net interest payments on the debt is 423 billion, and refundable tax credits 88 million. Okay, so that's 88 billion. Sorry. So you've got the pandemic. You see what happens in the pandemic. Where spending goes, basically it's spending goes wild. DC goes wild. But note this: you see interest payments at 423, it goes down to 387. Why? Lower interest rates. Basically getting significantly lower interest rates on debt instruments that were created and had to be rolled over. So because of that, you actually saw your net interest payments on the public debt going down. Now, this is not the public debt that's held. This is not the debt that's held by Social Security Trust Fund or the Federal Reserve or anybody like that. This is the public debt held by various countries around the world and banks. So you see that go down. You see it creep back up in 2021. Now you can see the interest rates going up. Interest rates go from 4, and it then goes up 100 billion, 120 billion in 2022. Now, obviously, we're borrowing a lot more money. Consequently, the amount of money we're borrowing is going up, but also the amount, so those interest rates hit right between the eyes because you weren't able to get a 1.5% 10-year Treasury here like you could here. Here you're getting them for 2.5%, 3%. Then you go to 2023 and those interest rates really kick in, and net interest on the public debt is now 710 billion. That's and you can see the trend line and the acceleration from 413 to 534 to 710 in 2 years. You've got a solid 70% increase in net interest payments on the debt, and that's going to continue to go up. It's going to go up for a simple reason: lower interest rate debt instruments that were 5-year treasuries, that were 2 and 3-year treasuries are rolling over, and as a result, they're having to be refinanced. Plus, you still have another $1.7 trillion in budget deficit from 2022. That 1.7 actually is 2023. That 1.7 trillion was actually really 2.1 trillion. There was a budget trick that occurred in 2022. Remember, Joe Biden tried to basically say, I'm wiping away $400 billion worth of student loan debt. The Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. That money was originally tabbed as being a cost, a revenue loss in 2022. Because the Supreme Court decision, that money then got taken out of 2022 and put into 2023 in terms of revenues. So you ended up with this number being cut to 1.7, when in fact the actual deficit, not counting that accounting trick, was 2.1 trillion. Just to be, it gets complicated, but that's the way it is. So let's look at a couple of other things, and just to show you the enormity of the problem. You would think, here, all other spending, that once again, that catch-all, that's defense, that's all that's all the other spending. 2.45. Well, the entirety of the combination of corporate and individual taxes, this is your income tax and corporate tax, not your Social Security tax. 2023, that was about 2.5 trillion. So it doesn't count this, it doesn't count that. Those are, about $900 billion of costs that weren't covered by the major taxes. Everything else comes in about 250 billion total. You scrape together all the tariffs and all that stuff. So at the very least, we aren't able to cover with the revenues we have coming in all of our spending besides Social Security, Medicare, and the mandatories, and our public interest payments on debt. We're not covering that right now. We're not covering that with the money we're bringing in. So what's happening with mandatory spending? Well, total mandatory spending revenues in terms of Social Security, Medicare, and the like came in about 1.6 trillion. And so you're looking at that's according to Janet Yellen. Let me show you that. See, I'll just highlight. Oops, got to make it bigger. If you see, this is a report that just came out from Janet Yellen from Treasury in terms of the fiscal year receipts from last year. You see that you had income taxes about 2.2 trillion. And individual income taxes, you had corporate 4.19, so that means about 2.6 trillion in terms of tax revenue in those two categories. Social Security was 1.6 trillion. So you see that right there. So 1.6 trillion. Well, once again, 1.6 trillion. Our spending was 2.8. So we're running a $1.2 trillion deficit in the Social Security and Medicare trust funds, effectively. Part of it's Medicaid, but those are the two big ones. Now, where's that money come from? Well, in the past, when we were running surpluses in those trust funds, we were in fact able to, those trust funds were buying bonds. They were buying treasury bills. And so those treasury bills were then throwing off an income into those trust funds. But now we're at the stage where we're actually selling those treasury bills to meet the demand, to meet the costs of Social Security, Medicare, and the like. And with all the money that gets brought in on Social Security, we're running a $1.2 trillion Social Security Medicare deficit right now. And that's just a function of, people living longer. It's a function of automatic cost of living increases. It's a function of a lot of different elements. But bottom line is, our deficit can almost totally be attributed to the $1.2 trillion deficit we're running in mandatory spending and the approximate $600 billion deficit we're running in when you count the total revenues and versus the public debt here and the all of the spending. So that's where our deficit is. It's where it's at. And so they're arguing over what you're going to do. So they got $2.4 trillion of spending, all of their spending. They got a $1.7 trillion, $1.8 trillion problem in terms of deficit spending. Which means if you cut 75% across the board, 75% of federal government spending that isn't Social Security, Medicare, or interest payments on the debt. If you got 75% of that spending, you then can balance your budget. Well, guess what? That's 75% less defense, 75% less border security, 75% less veterans benefits and the like. You're looking at this and you say, so when you look at this, that's why we're having a big fight about what to do about this, because there aren't easy answers. And Chip Roy and others are right when they say we need to slow the growth of government. They are 100% correct. But the problem is the Democrats and Joe Biden in the Senate don't want to slow the growth of government, and some of their Republican colleagues don't want to slow the growth of government. You try to take away some of the money for Amtrak, and you have a Northeastern Republican saying, no, I won't vote for it if you take away funding from Amtrak. So you can't even do little things in this environment of a 4-vote majority. And given that, that's why we got a problem. And we get all sick of it. We get disgusted by it. But the fact of the matter is what Speaker Johnson is trying to do. Now we'll go to what his solution is. What he's trying to do is a couple of things. First of all, one of the traps that the previous that was previously always put in people's face was they scheduled the government shutdown for like December 23. And then they told everybody, well, you don't get to go home for Christmas because because you can't go home if there's a government shutdown. And, everybody's, gets all upset. We don't want the government shutdown for Christmas, blah, blah, blah. And so you end up with basically deals where we continue spending at a breakneck speed with massive bills that nobody has any time to read, that are literally spending trillions of dollars, and with little to no negotiation on how to try to at least stem the tide in terms of increased growth. We have a circumstance, and I'm just going to go back to this one because it's really important. One of the things that this is the COVID level. This is the COVID level spending. COVID kicked in about 5 months into the fiscal year. Okay. So this was the fiscal year COVID spending. Then you had this year. You can see the jump from all of the spending went from 1.7 trillion, 2.2 trillion, 2.3 trillion. That's $600 billion increase from there to there. 2022, it goes to 2.7 trillion. So now you have a $1 trillion increase in all other spending from 2019 to 2022. $1 trillion. So one of the solutions, now, truthfully, you can't get a bipartisan agreement on this, and you can't get the Republicans even to agree on it. But if you roll back your spending to 2019 levels, all spending to 2019 levels, in terms of your not doing anything mandatories, you cut your federal budget by $1 trillion. We've increased the federal budget since 2019, actual spending, to 2022 by $1 trillion. Now it's already down to 2.4, so you're really only looking at a $700 billion cut. But the fact is, all that money, suddenly gets, everybody gets used to it. And what they have to do, so an obvious way to ratchet this back is to ratchet back to 2019 levels. There's just not political support for that. You've got things like, and that's our fault, because we haven't let Congress know that we expect them to cut the damn budget, cut spending. It's so we can look at this and say, listen, we got a $1.2 trillion budget deficit in Social Security, and that will be true. Social Security, Medicare, that's true. But the fact of the matter is, we're still $700 billion above the 2019 spending levels, and just by narrowing that spending is how and taking the actions, and Congress actually having to go with a real sharp knife and taking the actions necessary to get back to the 2019 spending levels. That is a partial solution to the problem. Isn't a total solution, it's a partial solution to the problem. That's not what we're going to be talking about, though, because the fact of the matter is, bills like the THUD, Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development, there was an amendment that would have cut $4.8 billion, or 4.8, yeah. It was cutting about $4.8 billion from the budget to return it to 2022 levels. Okay, because the THUD budget is being dramatically escalated because, remember, Joe Biden passed a a big transportation bill, infrastructure bill, and that hasn't been paid. That's paid for in the out years. It's not paid for. And so in 2023, they're saying, no, we're going to want the transportation budget back to 2022 levels because it's grown dramatically. That amendment didn't pass. So even it didn't pass. Republicans voted against it, saying we don't need to build a new FBI headquarters, about $300 million expenditure. That didn't pass. We in fact, we had about 70 Republicans vote against that. So ultimately, these decisions are small decisions that add up. They're small decisions that add up. And, because ultimately, everybody can't get everything. And what's going to happen is everybody's going to have to make a sacrifice to get the deficit number lower and to actually take a chunk out of the deficit. On the revenue side, revenues are down a little bit, and they're down largely because the Biden administration cooked into their thinking, into their estimates of what revenue should be, additional taxes. And that's why they're down. Here's what Speaker Johnson's trying to do. He's trying to get a two-tiered approach to this. There are 4 bills that have passed either the House or the Senate in terms of appropriations bills, some with both. And so he wants to have military construction, VA, agriculture, energy, water, and transportation HUD to be extended until January 19th. What that means is focus on those 4 bills, try to get something that the House and the Senate can agree on, hopefully that cuts the size of these bills, and be able to then focus on them, get them off the table, boom. Have a second continuing resolution for the other 8 bills that would be extended to February 2, with 2 weeks longer. Now, what's the objection to that? The extensions don't include cuts. They keep the spending level where it is right now. And, Chip Roy and others say we have to have cuts. Chip Roy and others are also saying not only do we have to have cuts, but we need to be doing something about the border. And this is a must-pass piece of legislation, and we need to put the House border policy of trying to crack down on the border and force Biden to actually follow the law. We won't put that into this. Now, you remember, that was the proposal that Speaker McCarthy supported, cutting the spending and putting the House border bill into a funding bill. It's a proposal that Matt Gaetz took down, said, nope, not voting for it. And as a result, that's what got us into this mess in the first place at some level, because that insistence that he wasn't going to allow that to occur, which had broad support across the House Republican Conference, because they didn't allow the cuts that were in the bill that was pushed by Chip Roy. Gaetz blocked it, and 6 others blocked it. So I think there's 20 who voted against it, Republicans. So so what do you have? You have, instead, now we've got a regular CR that's just going to continue resolution. That's just going to keep funding at the same level under this. And into that mix on January 1, you have an automatic cut that goes into effect because of the debt ceiling deal. And so it's going to get really complicated. But the simple fact is, the votes that are going to happen this week are going to be, they support splitting the appropriations bills into 2 categories, having them be continued for a short period of time, different lengths of time. And that's what they're looking at. If they can't do that, then what they'll be looking at is a continuing resolution for the rest of the year that will continue on, will just basically keep the same spending. And with the debt ceiling cuts coming into play, on January 1, which are pretty minuscule, but they're small cuts, and and punt it till next September. Those are the two things. Those are the two options that are on the table now. It is one of the great challenges on this is simple, because the regular legislative process doesn't work, and you can't. The only things you can actually get done in this town in DC are actually pass bills on must pass legislation like spending bills or the debt ceiling. You can't have. The House has already passed HR 2. They've sent it to the Senate. The Senate doesn't want anything to do with it. So you lose the opportunity to actually make policy changes because the regular legislative process is broken down, and the only time you get a chance to actually pass anything is through a funding bill, or a debt ceiling, or maybe a special appropriations. The other piece throw into this, Joe Biden's request for $105 billion for Israel, Ukraine, processing people at the border. It's not really border. It's not border security. It's just processing people at the border. Some additional submarines. Put those into the mix of $105 billion request on top of the regular budget. And what Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell want to do is they want to put that request and package it into the funding bill and throw it all together and say, here's a big old mix, here's a big old pile, and you can't really break any of the pile out. And what Speaker Johnson is doing is he's trying to break the different pieces apart so you can have an honest discussion on the spending on Ukraine, the spending on new submarines, on the spending on, and why that spending on new submarines isn't in the defense appropriations bill, which is where it should have been. So those are all, and on the border. So those are all real questions that they're going to be talking about. Bottom line is, we are in deep trouble. The downgrade that's talked about should have the effect of raising interest rates for federal debt. Raising interest rates for federal debt increases this net interest on the public debt significantly at a time when it's skyrocketing. It's skyrocketing, 70, a little over 70% increase between 2021 and 2023, 3 years, actually 2 years. If that rate of increase continues, we're looking at $1 trillion next year. So we have the pressure of our interest rates going up because of not being able to deal with the debt. The fact there's not a political will in the House to deal with the debt, and this attempt to cobble something together in a government where you have Joe Biden who doesn't think there is a debt. You have the Democrats in the House who seem quite fine with, they'd cut the entire defense budget if they could, except for Ukraine. And Republicans who are sitting there kind of, have lost their way on the debt issue, quite honestly. But it's really up to you. It's up to me. We have to make debt, the debt issue, the deficit issue, a political issue. We have to make it worth fighting over, and show, because this is the issue that will define more than any other whether the United States is going to survive. We're plummeting towards a fiscal disaster. We may be, we always say, well, you want to put the brakes before you go off the cliff. We may be off the cliff. When you see the acceleration, 70% acceleration in 2 years of your net interest payments on the debt, that's an indication, that's an acceleration that indicates you may be off the cliff. And it's really, really hard to stop that increase without drastic measures on the rest of the spending. And that's why I always say there's nothing compassionate about spending more money. There's nothing compassionate about raising the Medicaid eligibility to 300% of the poverty rate. That's not compassionate. That's stupid. Because when we run out of money, which we're running out of, when we run out of the ability to borrow the money, which is with the increased interest rates, that's a very real concern. Who's going to get hurt? A family that makes $84,000 a year and is on federal government health assistance, who could pay for their own? No, it's the family that makes poverty rate, makes 20,000, 25,000, 30,000, who can't afford to pay for their own. Those are the ones who are going to get hurt. So every time they create a middle class entitlement, it hurts the people who actually need the social safety net. And we could argue whether the social safety net should exist or not. Fact is, it does. Every time you expand eligibility, you do harm to the people who absolutely depend upon it for their existence, for their survival. That's not compassionate. That's just brazenly stupid. And yet that's what happens when we hear these people talk about, gee whiz, we need to encourage states. And there's 7 states that have not raised the Medicaid eligibility up to 300%. We hear people arguing that should happen. No, it shouldn't. In fact, all 43 states that have it at 300% should return it back to 200% and save about $100 billion in costs on Medicaid right there. Now, to some people who currently have Medicaid, got it since through Obamacare, would they have to start not having it? Absolutely, they would. But if we're going to save the social safety net for the least of these, we can't have people who can afford to not have it benefiting from it. I'm not talking about Social Security, which it's an insurance policy that people have paid for over time. I'm not talking about Medicare, although there are proposals to make Medicare more expensive in terms of co-pays and the like. But in terms of things which are expanding eligibility for S-chip and other food stamps and other things like that, by expanding eligibility for welfare programs and expanding that eligibility into the middle class, the Democrats are trying to vote by middle class votes, but what they're really doing is they're stealing the future from those at the bottom of the scale and are for votes right now. And this is not sustainable, folks. What you're looking at right here, not sustainable. And this number right here is gold, ought to scare the hell out of you. It scares the hell out of me. With that, that's the fight. That's what's going on. It's pretty intractable. There's not a lot of the speaker has a real hard time getting to yes on anything right now, because some people look at this and they say, we have to cut the budget deficit now. We have to cut the spending now. They're right. And other people say, well, gee whiz, I don't want to cut the spending at all. Unfortunately, there's more people in the House and Senate who prefer not to cut the spending at all and prefer to increase the spending than those who would prefer to cut it. It comes down to primaries, folks. You need to elect people in primaries who want to cut the deficit and are willing to fight to do it. So with that, I'm going to sign off. I'll look at, and I just hope that you all understand this better. So when you're watching what's going on this week, you'll have a better understanding of kind of where we are, how we got there, and the limited choices on how to deal with it. With that, you guys have a great day.